Hi, poets. I'm Liz Whiteacre, and we're going to talk about lines and breath in this video. With this topic, I wanted to take a moment to share a behind the scenes. I have a book out called Hindsight 2040. And in this collection, I found a manuscript I wrote when I was an undergrad, taking poetry writing courses, and started to really reflect on who I was at that time in my life. In my 40s, kind of thinking through what have I learned in the last 20 years? What has changed? Were there memories I couldn't even remember anymore, emotions where I was curious about where that came from? So, from that distance, from that hindsight, I started to think about how I felt now and what advice would I give my 20-year-old self. Today, I'd like to focus on two poems in that collection, and more specifically, the poem The Day Our Cat Died, Reflecting at 40. So that poem I wrote in my 40s started with this poem, The Day My Dog Died, that I wrote in my 20s. This poem is about a narrator observing her friends discovering a dog who's been hit by a car on the street. And it chronicles the different characters' reactions to finding that animal. And throughout the poem, the narrator is pretty distant and not quite sure how she would want to process it herself. Uh, in the end, the last stanza, spoilers, Jenny stood up and rubbed her fists and her red eyes. Sarah kicked a rock with her sandal, stalling at the curb, her pink t-shirt sticking to her narrow frame in the heat. And I remembered I didn't own a dog. That Spike, Randy, Spot, Bailey waited, legs in air for someone to call his name aloud. But the buzz of lawnmowers muffled any silence. So when I found that poem 20 years later, um, I immediately connected to the death of a beloved pet that I was responsible for as an adult. So this was the first animal that I was a caretaker for. Uh, in my youth, in elementary school, my family had a cat who was with us for some years, had some really wicked experiences with liver disease and problems with his kidneys. So he did not live a long time. But I suddenly found myself connecting to a death that felt much more real than that imagined death. So I started writing back to Liz in her 20s, uh, leaping from the day our dog died to the day our cat died. Here you'll notice that I was sticking to a very similar structure, and that's what I do throughout the collection. I try to stick to the format as much as I can in my poem written in my 40s as I did in my 20s. And in this first draft, it it worked. It got to the heart. I'll just read the end of this poem. It's resolution. I still cringe when I see soft fur curled or crushed on a road, a sidewalk, a ditch, a parking lot, the curb by someone's home. Because after we got the call, we stopped short because we didn't know. You didn't recognize grief then, young girl, or understand that such a short, soft life could leave such hollowness. So there's a difference in the response to grief and losing a beloved pet in the two poems. I felt that this form, right, writing it essentially as a story. The second poem kind of jumps back and forth through time a little bit more than the first story, which really tells here's this discovery from start to finish. But I felt that the conventional way of presenting punctuation, kind of each line was falling based on a phrase, a thought, an image, like the first one, but it didn't get to that sense of great distress, great grief, trying to process it in the moment that I felt this poem, this new poem, honoring the cats, deserved. So I started to play around a little bit and making some different choices. One thing I did was remove punctuation. Punctuation can often feel absolutely invisible. So if everything is punctuated conventionally, we readers don't even notice it because like we just read it so quickly. When you strip away the punctuation and you leave some in and take some out, suddenly as readers, we have to be a little bit more involved and pay closer attention to how the poet is guiding us through. So a little bit of friction can be created there. Now, if you strip a poem entirely of its punctuation and you do a great job of kind of using phrases or units of thought, and you're guiding your reader through the poem very effortlessly, then it can also feel as seamless and invisible as conventional punctuation. But I started to put in some asides. You'll notice that there are parentheses here. There's a little bit of extra spacing. For example, in that first stanza, I put in the word breathe, right? A reminder. I've just gotten a phone call that something I love so dearly died. And trying to remind myself I need to calm down visually, spreading out that word, giving it some space in between each letter was a way that I hoped I was doing that for my readers as well. So this starts to follow a similar format as the first poem, but I still wasn't entirely satisfied. Y'all, when I heard about our cat's death, like I was ugly crying. Truly, I was weeping, and I felt that I could infuse that more in the poem with the way I was asking readers to use breath, the way they were navigating the poem. And so I went a step further. This is what the poem looks like in the book. Um, this is something that I found much more satisfying. And you'll see that there are a variety of strategies here. There's the sense of a prose poem kind of running left to right. So we have some lines that move very, very quickly that don't have a lot of obstacles in them. And then there are some lines that have maybe, I'm looking at but the years, just 3 words, right? And then you have to pick up and then move over and then go a white space to parentheses, those years. And so there's more that you have to navigate. You end up slowing down. I also thought to put in caesuras, and those are those big white blank spaces that are happening at the start of a line or within a line, because I wanted readers to have an opportunity to take a deep breath, to have a big pause in between different moments. I chose to have lines starting not just on the left margin, also because a lot of memories are coming up when the speaker, when I was living this, got the call about our cat's death. And so things are just kind of popping up. The speaker is not in control at this moment. And so kind of having things shift around, making the reader have to work a little bit harder to follow along felt appropriate in this moment. So you have the ability in the way you choose to put the words on the page, how you're presenting them, in the order, of course, but also just spatially, to really invite your reader, if they're willing to go on that journey with you, to engage with the information that's coming to them in different ways. This speaker in the poem is incredibly upset, deeply grieving, all over the place emotionally. And so I wanted to make sure that the reader felt that way at the end of the poem too. And so the physical act of going through this poem and making it to the end, right? That hollowness sitting all by itself, lonely at the bottom of the page, you feel as a reader a release, right? It was strenuous on your mind, on your breath if you're reading it out loud, and also physically, just with your eyeballs having to move around at that rapid pace, slowing down, speeding up again, having the current moment, having asides, moving from the present tense to the past tense, knowing that all of this is written from a present looking back to the past. A lot is happening. So my intent was for the reader to feel as exhausted, sad, lonely, maybe even a little angry at the end of reading the poem as I was feeling in that moment. So you can see that there is a big difference between that and this narrative that I have carefully crafted and my 20-year-old self kind of creating this moment of reflection that did not have lived experience directly connected to it. It's a little bit more of an intellectual exercise, an exercise of compassion, where the speaker is absolutely trying to connect with the loss of this dog, but it's not her dog, so it's not quite the same as that experience with losing that beloved pet. This is the only poem in the collection, kind of writing from my 40s back to my 20s, where I break form so dramatically. All of the other poems, as you kind of put them side by side, they mirror each other, they echo each other. But in this particular instance, I felt that the reader was better served by breaking out and finding a more authentic form for this particular moment than sticking to that script of the original. So that's why I wanted to share this poem and give you a behind the scenes today. As you're writing, and also as you're reading too, it's important to think about the poet's intention. That might be your intention if you're writing. And also, when you're reading something, what is the poet's intention? Maybe you're starting to get frustrated with the poem because the speaker is frustrated in that moment. Maybe you're supposed to feel very mellow and reflective and calm and peaceful because that's how the speaker feels in that moment. So we can use structure, we can use line breaks, we can use breath, and a lot of different ways to kind of match up the physical experience reading the poem to the emotional content that the poem is trying to communicate as well. It's also important to think about consistency. If you think of a poem as kind of like its own world, right? You want to think about, well, what are the rules for that world? If I strip punctuation out of my poem and I'm not using any of it, but I have one comma at the end of a line, 3/4 of the way through, what does that say, right? That comma has a lot of attention drawn to it. Was it a typo? You just forgot to take it out? Or is that some sort of pivot point? Readers enjoy kind of the mystery, right? As the poem is guiding them through, we want to make sure that there is that intention, and that as different things happen that might surprise us or confuse us or frustrate us, that at the end of the poem, there's going to be a payoff that comes with that clarity. We think, oh, that's why that was happening in that poem, because at the end, I'm supposed to feel angry. I'm supposed to feel just really anxious because there were no breaks, right? It was all one big sentence, all one big breath. So if you keep those three things in mind as a reader of the poem, it can help provide insights into the poems that you're reading and give you, I don't know, the pleasure of understanding perhaps why the poet's choices are adding up to a particular understanding or experience. Um, and then as a writer, thinking about your intention, being consistent, and working towards clarity, maybe transparency, maybe, if you want to think of it that way. I'm making these choices for these reasons so that readers can figure it out. That can help guide you through revision. Now, it is very hard on the very first draft to write something that is 100% intentional, very consistent clarity. So give yourself a lot of grace on those first drafts, and just know that through the process of revision, if you're coming back to these three touchstones, it'll help guide you through that process. We have a lot of different strategies that we can use, techniques in our toolbox. If we think about Ted Kooser's metaphor for all of the different things we can use to shape and form poems. In the poem that I picked, The Day My Cat Died, Reflecting at 40, if you kind of look inside the paint cans, prose can be used where you're choosing to run your line all the way from the left to the right margin without an intentional break, using shorter or longer lines for pacing, enjambment, breaking off in an unexpected place, a place that might not make sense right away. Thinking about ending on nouns and verbs that give us pictures and actions to think about, have them reverberate in our minds as you go. Thinking about breaking at punctuation, which also often signals natural pauses, and also thinking about your breath. When you're getting started with a poem, if you're not sure what your intention is yet, kind of reading through and identifying where do you pause as you read the poem can be a great place to start. And then, of course, the recipe or the fixed form. In this particular poem, I didn't start with a recipe like a sonnet or a villanelle, right? We have recipes that have been developed over centuries that we can find in books for free online, get challenges from our friends. I chose to create my own recipe, working off the form of that original poem that I wrote about the dog's death in my 20s. So you can think about setting yourself an intention. I'm going to write a poem that looks like a box, or I'm going to write a poem that looks like butterfly wings, or I'm going to write a poem with really long lines. And then you have to decide whether or not in the end that form matches up with the content. I'm using paint as a metaphor here because your line, your form is structural. But it's important to remember that the poem can function in a variety of ways sometimes. And that when you have the nice structure of the kitchen, right, you also have an opportunity to decide, well, what's the vibe if it's an orange kitchen, right? What's the vibe if it's gray? What's the vibe if it's blue? So you can kind of test out some different techniques that might elevate tension, release tension, add that extra physical layer of what's happening to the reader while they're reading it, and see whether or not that's something that could serve the poem and make it an even more enjoyable, engaging experience. So here are some questions you can ask yourself while you're reading a poem, or while you might be revising a poem that you've written. Right? What is the first visual impression? How are readers invited into the poem? How does the line length set the poem's pace? How does this pace serve the voice, establish the mood or tone? Where's emphasis placed? Does the emphasis serve the message or create a moment of exultation, despair, epiphany, joy? How and where is tension built and released? How do the line breaks guide the reader? Are those line breaks intuitive, barely noticed? Do they become thematic? Do we have to work for it? And in working for it, we are rewarded by having an emotional experience like the speaker in the poem. I'll be sharing a link to this Google Doc. And at the very end, I have annotated or provided notes on different strategies I used in this poem. And so I've noted it in the poem. And then over here, I have explained what's happening because, again, this poem is using a lot of different techniques. I invite you to check it out if you're interested in learning more about different terms like anaphora, caesura, those sorts of things, and how italics can be used in different ways. If you have any questions, please reach out and let me know. Thank you for spending time with me on this poem and listening to the behind the scenes. And I hope that as you are drafting and revising your poem, that these different strategies and this perspective helps give you opportunities to try out new things with your work. Thanks.